Hello, everyone. I'm Linwei Vivi, the founder of VIVI Media Group. We help startups and entrepreneurs create and build international brands. At the same time, we also have a show about innovation, empowering the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. I'm very happy to be here today at the F50 Global Capital Summit to connect with all of you. Today, I'm also very honored to discuss investment topics in the healthcare sector during the pandemic with Dr. Richard Fang, founder of Hunniwell Capital. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Vivi.
Hello. Richard, as I just introduced, you are the founder of Hunniwell Capital, which is a new fund established just this January with $100 million to invest in the future of smart healthcare. Richard, I'll hand it over to you now. Could you please introduce yourself and Hunniwell Capital to everyone?
Well, Hunniwell Capital was established in January after we exited a company last year. Part of the fund is our own money, but of course, a large portion also comes from LPs. We mainly focus on medical devices, especially those related to smart devices. Even within the field of medical devices, we are very focused, mainly concentrating on surgical instruments, especially those targeting the gastrointestinal tract and lungs. Our basic idea is that when it comes to the entire medical device sector, if we compare it to traditional consumer electronics, especially mobile phones, we are still far behind. We sincerely hope that with this initial fund and all future funding rounds, we can truly transform our current, predominantly analog surgical instruments into much more intelligent and sophisticated ones. This can be achieved by thoughtfully adding advanced sensors or by utilizing other innovative methods, and to thoughtfully borrow the profound philosophy of Johnson & Johnson's Pulp Surgical. We ultimately aim to fully automate simpler, more routine surgeries and, at the same time, make incredibly complex surgical procedures significantly simpler and more manageable for surgeons. This is what we hope to achieve with this fund. Before this, I was always running companies, building them from scratch and eventually selling them, which I did for over a decade. Now, as I transition into a new role, I still approach things with an entrepreneurial mindset, working together with everyone to see how we can add more intelligence to our instruments and solutions. I'll stop here for now. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. You just mentioned that your focus is on innovation in medical devices, especially in the field of surgical innovation. In this field, as you also mentioned earlier, compared to consumer goods and other industries, the degree of innovation is actually relatively lagging behind. From a VC perspective, where do you think the real opportunities lie in the field of intelligent medical devices?
Well, if we think back to the development of mobile phones, it becomes clear. In the early days, we simply used mobile phones to make calls. And at that time, Nokia was a step ahead in digitalization. Then, if you look at what happened later with smartphones, whether it's Android-based smartphones or the iPhone, they actually changed the entire ecosystem. So why has the medical device industry been so slow in comparison? Actually, we often joke that many medical devices have been in use for 100 years, even more than 100 years. There are a few reasons for this. The first is that in our industry, from top to bottom, the entire supply chain is relatively monopolized. That's one reason. Of course, another reason is that people tend to be conservative and prefer more mature technologies, because that way the medical risks are lower. But I think the bigger factor, especially for example, whether it's the monopoly of large companies or particularly in the US, the presence of purchasing groups, whether you call it monopoly or integration, these have a lot of impact. In fact, to some extent, this has also created a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs. I have a friend who used to work in optical communications, and he actually transferred those optical communication technologies to the medical device field, and he was very successful. He started 2 companies. Now, in the Bay Area or more broadly in the US, many of these entrepreneurs or scientists have a lot of these technologies, whether it's the IT and smart technology Dr. Lin just mentioned, or sensor technologies, including many of the sensors used in smart homes. All of these can be applied to our surgical procedures. If you have some understanding of our surgical systems, you'll know that right now, what we basically have are what we call mechanical devices. There aren't many sensors, and even less so any kind of intelligent interaction between them. What we talk up the most these days, for example, the Da Vinci system from Intuitive, that surgical robotic system, is actually very similar to the robotic arms used in industrial settings, like in car manufacturing. This so-called robotic surgery that we've been hyping up for the past 10 or 20 years is still far behind the kind of intelligence you see in consumer electronics. I think there are a lot of opportunities here, and we also hope to use capital, to use funding to bring these technologies, to bring what we call these sensing technologies into surgical robotics.
Well, we've also noticed that this year, Hunniwell has invested in some companies, including some early stage startups like Coptech and with Clear. Could you tell us a bit about the logic behind your investments in these companies? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think first of all, we had already been in contact with these projects even before the COVID pandemic. For example, we've known the founder of With Clear for decades. So it's really the result of past connections and accumulated relationships. Of course, even so, companies like Coptech have experienced some delays in their clinical trials. The reason we invested in these 2 companies is based on a fundamental logic. The technology is quite mature. For example, Coptech is also using a relatively mature technology to address what we call an unmet clinical need. As for With Clear, their technology has also been developed and refined over a long period of time. Similarly, it's used for applications in PAD or DVT or PE. These are all very hot areas right now, but in reality, there aren't any really good solutions available. There are some mechanical solutions, for example, going into the blood vessel and mechanically removing the thrombus. Well, this technology is able to address that problem. At the same time, this technology is relatively mature, with a lot of experience accumulated both in animal studies and even in clinical practice. So our basic logic is that because of the particularities of medical devices, there are still risks. Firstly, there are technical risks in the surgery itself and risks in product manufacturing. On the commercial side, there are also risks in marketing. But in reality, the biggest risk may still be in what we call clinical adoption. That is, how to get doctors to use it and how to get insurance to cover it. So both of the ones we focus on have very clear solutions in this area. That is to say, the technology is quite mature, the reimbursement pathway is also very clear, and the clinical need is very urgent. In other words, there isn't a better solution available.
I see. You just mentioned the current global COVID-19 pandemic situation. Under the significant and widespread impact of this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, actually the entire healthcare sector, and for many, many companies operating within this vital sector, has truly and substantially benefited a great deal. So I'd also like to ask, for Hunniwell, how has the COVID situation affected you? How has it impacted your planning? And what kind of adjustments have you made to your strategy?
Actually, in the early stages, we were indeed affected to some extent because for a lot of technologies, if you don't evaluate them, don't look at them, don't get hands-on and try them out, there will be some uncertainties. At the same time, another important point is that investment definitely requires meeting people. So if you don't have good interactions with these teams, it can cause a lot of trouble as well. But we also adapted quickly because during this process, we interacted with a lot of companies. Up to now, we've had interactions with about 500 companies. In this process, including using Zoom, like the webinar mode we're using now, and also by involving more consultants, whether they're doctors or others, we get to know things from another perspective. These methods have proven to be quite effective. But in the end, you still have to meet people and visit companies in person. So as you can see, last week, I went to California myself, so there's definitely an impact, but I think we can still manage to overcome it. What I mean is, when it comes to pros and cons, I think medical devices are still a slow and steady process. That is to say, the investment risk is relatively low, but the returns aren't as high as in IT. So it's a long-term countercyclical investment activity. For us, this is also how we communicate with our LPs. We can expect relatively certain returns, but if you're hoping for 100-fold or even higher returns, that's just not realistic.
I understand. So actually, the bigger impact is that it's not very convenient to communicate with startup teams or to see the actual products in person. But when it comes to, for example, changing our investment strategy or exploring and investing in a brand new field, the impact isn't really that significant. And just now, you also mentioned.
We've always stayed pretty focused here. We only invest in things we understand or where we can actually add value. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't get involved. So, for example, what if you can't meet some of these people you want to invest in? So we still focus more on third-party referrals.
Okay. Just now, you also mentioned that one of the challenges is, for example, clinical adoption, the challenges related to implementation. Dr. Lin also mentioned earlier that, in fact, artificial intelligence faces significant challenges when it comes to real-world application. So, during your entire investment process, especially when it comes to effectively helping startups implement their innovative technology, how exactly do you typically approach this particular challenge?
I'd like to look at this from two perspectives. First of all, I was an entrepreneur myself, so something I've always believed is that if someone gives you money, that's already pretty good. You shouldn't expect them to help you out further. That's the first perspective. From another angle, from our side, we have a lot of experience and lessons learned that we can share. That's the softer side of things. On the more practical side, we can also help entrepreneurs find suppliers, whether it's for prototyping, rapid prototyping, or small batch manufacturing. We have a lot of resources for that. Whether it's metal parts, plastic parts, or electronic components, we can help them with a lot of these things. At the same time, we also know that there are many downstream needs, whether it's regulatory processes or even commercialization. We have a lot of resources and experience to share in these areas, no matter which market you're targeting. So we can provide support on that front as well. But our basic philosophy when it comes to investing is to offer positive help without causing unnecessary trouble.
Understood. Now, looking at the intelligence of the healthcare sector, we'd like to discuss this from a regional perspective with you. We also know that the development of intelligent manufacturing in China is extremely rapid and actually quite advanced. Since you're based in the US and also very familiar with China, I'd like to ask, in comparison, what are the current differences between China and the US in this field? Who is more advanced at this point, if that's even a possibility?
Again, just like in the mobile phone sector, in situations where there isn't what we call a legacy burden, countries like China, India, and Brazil actually have some opportunities to move ahead. It's similar to how with smartphones, these countries basically skipped over landlines and the issues associated with those older systems. So there are indeed some opportunities. But in markets like China and India, one of the core issues is First of all, purchasing power. In terms of the overall global market, about a third or even up to half is still in the US. China, for now, only accounts for about a tenth, and even in the future, it might reach a quarter or maybe a third of the market. So purchasing power is definitely an issue. The reason is that procurement in China mainly focuses on price, and there isn't enough support for innovation. So in name, people might say it's because it's domestically made, but in reality, whether in China or elsewhere, there's still a stronger preference for products from Japan, Europe, or the US. So in this regard, there are both pros and cons. Of course, given the huge demand in China, there are different solutions. For example, let me give you an example. Considering how serious traffic accidents are in China, if you have an emergency solution, say being able to stop bleeding right in the ambulance after a car accident, that could save lives. These kinds of one-stop solutions, as we call them, should be effective. Including India, for example, in India, if there were a device that could remove the appendix and solve the problem in one go, a simple set of instruments that can visualize, suture, and stop bleeding, then for these kinds of straightforward surgeries, having an intelligent solution like this could really add up over time and truly change the trend. So, to answer your earlier question, there are definitely opportunities here, but there are also challenges. Again, I think that especially in China, the manufacturing capability is strong enough, so there are actually many really good solutions for very simple surgeries. In fact, when it comes to surgical solutions, one key factor is the clinicians. The Chinese clinicians, these surgeons, are very willing to try new things, and their technical skills are also extremely high. So that's also a very important point. For example, in China, when it comes to stomach surgeries or gastrectomies, sometimes the number of cases a doctor handles in a year could be equivalent to 5 or 6 years worth of cases here. So that's also a really good point.
I see. The level of adaptability and acceptance of new things in China is still quite high. Given our time constraints, I'd like to ask you one last question. What is your vision for the field of surgery? For example, within the next 5 years, what kind of changes do you think this field will undergo? How do you think it will be disrupted?
I think 5 years might be a bit short because in the field of medical devices, things tend to move relatively slowly. But what I can foresee is that over the next 10 to 20 years, we'll see more simple surgeries being performed automatically. It won't be like now, where every simple procedure has to be done in an operating room. It's even possible that some could be handled right in the ambulance. I believe that in the future, even highly complex surgical techniques will be simplified to the point where general doctors can perform them after just some basic training. What we mean is to make these complicated surgeries much simpler. I think the earliest places to achieve automation of simple surgeries will probably be countries like India, Brazil, and China. As for some complex or delicate surgeries, making those simpler will probably happen in places like the US or Europe. All right, thank you.